Danny, Soundcheck 1, 2. Danny, Soundcheck. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah. Nick, Soundcheck.
Danny, Soundcheck 1, 2. And Nick, go ahead one more time.
Nick, Soundcheck 1, 2.
Okay, thanks. And we are live. Nicholas Simpson. This was a long time coming, so I sincerely appreciate it. We were originally scheduled for Friday.
Oh, hold on. Good start.
Originally scheduled for Friday, but we moved this to today. And we'll just give this a second. Hi, chat. How are you guys doing? Thank you so much for being here, Steph. Sincerely appreciate it. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us on a Sunday. But what I was saying with Nick was originally this is going to be a Georgie, you and I, because third person is always extremely fun. But exercise is something that's so often brought up, and it's not my forte, you know? And so I don't even think Georgie would say it's his forte either. But I was saying one of the reasons I like you is because you put yourself out there. You have this excellent Instagram, which I have on the screen right now, Nicholas Simpson Fit. And I think your thigh is bigger than my entire torso and head. So I think you know what you're talking about. So thank you very much for joining me on the stream. It's been a long time coming. I don't know how long, but we've been communicating for a long time.
Yeah, and like initially we talked about doing one last year, and then I think it just fizzled on my end a little bit.
Was that
last
year? Wasn't
it?
it?
It was over a year ago for sure. And then it's fortunately we couldn't make it work with Georgie tonight. It'll be fun to go back and forth with him sometime, but
100%. Yeah, I mean, you're welcome anytime, so I sincerely appreciate it. I actually have a funny story because we had always communicated via email, and I remember like typing in the hashtag #RayPete in Instagram one time, and I think I found your Nicholas Simpson Fit Instagram, and I was like, oh dude, this guy is super jacked and he's like into #RayPete stuff. And then at some point I was like, oh my god, this is like the same guy you've been communicating with. And so what I was about to say was I like people that have skin in the game, and so I think that that kind of motivates me to talk to them because I feel like they're putting themselves out there, and I appreciate that. Like, I don't want to talk to a bunch of anonymous people on a forum or whatever. That's not really that fun.
You definitely, it's been a shift for me because I tend towards the more introverted side, but
join the club.
Yeah, I think I probably had like at least 4 or 5 years where I wasn't on social media at all, like no Facebook, no Instagram, no anything. And that was think it was good. It was super productive, but I do feel a little bit of a responsibility to like contribute sometimes and just to get ideas out there, good or bad, and just to like get feedback on things and then to develop those further. That's a fun process.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a balance. I remember it must have been a few years ago when, what was it, like the huge Zuckerberg Facebook news that they were, it's nothing anybody didn't know about the harvesting of all the information and things. And I think to myself, I was like, I'm going to deactivate my Facebook and kind of see how I feel. And it was definitely nice because I would log on to Facebook and just like stare at the screen. I'd literally be doing nothing, you know? So you have to do these things, I guess, or if you're in my line of work or whatever, and you have an opinion, it's not the greatest thing to have no social media presence, but somebody like yourself who's intelligent and spreading an intelligent message, I just love it because as we'll get into it, your different graphs and things, and it's one thing to talk in a technical way, and it's another thing to try to bring it down and to teach it, because that requires some elegance, and you making like just the graphics and stuff is really cool.
Actually, I did a little mini presentation that related to some of those concepts recently, but part of what I talked about was that most people, when they think of someone intelligent, they think of like logic, and they think of that as the height of just intelligent thinking in general. But then the classic Einstein quote is that you don't understand something really well until you can explain it simply, or explain it to a 6-year-old or something like that. And I think what that quote is describing is the analogical reasoning that Ray's spoken about sometimes, but the process of thinking and reasoning in analogies, so that you might have this, you might have a thought that seems simple to you if you came to it logically, but if that happened like over 10 or 50 or 100 steps and you've repeated that process, it would seem simple to you. But then to try to explain that to someone else that doesn't have the same background, like even if they did have the time to listen to you, it's just not really feasible most of the time. And if you can have empathy and like an understanding of where someone else is coming from and what their knowledge base is, and then try to find the common grounds between those concepts, I think that's really powerful.
When I think of intelligence, I almost exclusively think of Neil deGrasse Tyson. So he's number one. But you're right. I have quotes on my Instagram, multiple people saying that like the greatest form of intellect was like maybe it was creativity or something, because that's what I feel like. I think you're totally right that there's like this like what the culture says is intelligence couldn't be farther from the truth, because I know a lot of people that are like book smart, but they, like you said, they have the complete inability to do that Aristotle quote where it says like the mark of an educated person is to hold an idea without accepting it. And I knew almost nobody that could do that in where I lived in San Francisco. And all these people were like highly educated in these different schools. But the inflexibility, I started to think that, Ray was always talking about it, and then I saw it play out in real time. Like there was zero ability to look at a problem from a different angle, or to not identify in any way, shape, or form with some idea that they found to be like intolerable, basically.
Yeah. I think Ray's talked about it in one of his articles too, where he used an example where one of the more well-known IQ tests is the Miller's Analogies test. And I think it's just filled with questions like, if Rembrandt is to so-and-so, then so-and-so is to someone else or something, and you being able to recognize the appropriate association. And on one hand, you can say, like, what would some aspects of history and popular culture or whatever it may be have to do with my intelligence. But really, when you think of intelligence and analogies as a form of pattern recognition, then there is a component of just knowledge and awareness that plays into that. And then Ray's story was that when they gave that to a bunch of PhD students, they all scored fairly average on it. And he thought they were like, the implication was that they were selecting for inside the box thinking.
Well, speaking of thinking outside the box, and so do you want to give a little bit of background or maybe your origin story of how you got to Ray? Because I think that would be just in general pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say that you're some disciple of his or anything either. Just that thinking when I say get to Ray, meaning he's an interesting character with some interesting ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. I like, the classic Bruce Lee quote where he just says like, take what is useful or absorb what is useful and then discard what is not. And I was trying to keep that pretty middle ground view and opinion on too many things, but just take from it and then not get too bothered about the rest. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, and that was from the University of Calgary in 2010. More or less since then, so I guess around the last 9 years, I've been working with high performance sport. And it's no secret, like you can see on my Instagram, and I get tagged in things. And it's with the Canadian national speed skating team who takes up most of my time. And then I also do some work with the swimmers at the university. And just a disclaimer again, I'll say that all my views and opinions are my own, so they don't reflect those of speed skating or the Sport Institute that I work with. But with that said, I've had an interest in fitness and performance for a long time. I think I was initially just a pretty skinny kid and wanted to put on some muscle, and started doing a little bit more like bodybuilding oriented training when I was in junior high school. Eventually I didn't want to be that big. I thought it looked a little bit gross. And I got more interest in the performance aspect of it and just lifting heavier loads and weights and getting strong. So did a bit of powerlifting and weightlifting. And like a lot of young people, I pretty much felt invincible for a lot of that time. And as the years went on, just realized that wasn't the case. And through my own experiences, and then through trying to help others too, just taking on more and more of an interest in health over the years. I guess probably specifically what led me to finding some of Ray's stuff was, I think it was around 2012, I was doing a certification that was hosted by a guy, Charles Poliquin, or the late Charles Poliquin.
R.I.P.
Yeah. And again, he was one of those figures that was very polarizing. So people either loved him or hated him. And I think he had a lot of good material on training, but then a lot of individuals with more of a science background didn't like how he promoted some of the nutrition and supplement things, or just how cavalier he was in general. And he was pretty aggressive and outspoken too, and didn't really tolerate what he thought was stupidity, which itself is a bit polarizing, but that's what sells too. Like, no one really likes to buy the it depends answer. So that's marketing, and people will take advantage of that, and that doesn't always reflect who they are. But in one of those courses, he'd been recommending high doses of fish oil for fat loss. And that was something I decided to try for a little while. And it was probably too much and too long. And at some point, I just started to get these weird symptoms. Like I would take my supplement in the morning and then go to school or go to work, or work at that time, I guess, and get this really sudden extreme somnolence come on. So like barely able to keep my eyes open, just felt super tired. My eyes would start vibrating a little bit sometimes. And it took me a little bit of time to figure out what it was, but my wife, who was also doing this, or then girlfriend, she started to experience the same thing. We kind of, everything on the internet that time was just saying how awesome fish oil was.
Is this what year is this?
2012, 2013, or
that, I think that was like Rob Wolf's fish oil calculator was probably online back then.
Yeah.
And like the whole 9. Do you remember that? It would recommend like gigantic doses of fish oil you'd put in your body weight. It was like a notorious calculator. And then Rob and the whole 9 people basically at some point became embarrassed about it and took it off. But continue,
Yeah.
Keep going.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of talk then too about balancing, and I guess still to an extent balancing your omega-3 and omega-6 ratios.
Yeah.
But the approach more people took was just they were still eating their diets loaded with omega-6s, and then the strategy to balance it was to add a crap ton of omega-3s.
Yeah.
Rather than just kind of reducing the 6 side of things. And there was a company in Calgary that was doing blood work, focusing on health, and they were actually giving monetary rewards for people that could reach a 1-to-1 ratio. But then you had these people that were just like crushing bottles of fish oil the day before the test, and it would jack up the ratio, and then they'd get like a check for $1,000 or something.
Oh my God. Nice.
But yeah, I went down the list of like trying to think of possible different things it could be, and I tried smaller amounts and different brands, but once it had come on, it seemed like my body didn't really tolerate it at all anymore. And Ray's article, like the Great Fish Oil Experiment, was the only thing basically on the internet I found at that time that was saying anything potentially negative about it. But just the general idea that it oxidized very unsaturated fat from cold water fish, where it's more stable at cold temperatures, and then regardless of whether it's fresh or rancid in the bottle, once it's inside your body at 37 degrees, it's going to have some issues with stability and potentially cause problems because of that, which would be maybe a separate and longer term problem to any legitimate anti-inflammatory effects it does have.
Did that make sense to you given your scientific background?
Yeah, I guess like I've always been pretty interested in learning, and I don't know what started it, but I do remember like even back in junior high when I would often ask my parents a question, they would just tell me to look it up in the dictionary. And I don't know if that was it, but I did just develop this habit of if I wanted to know something, then just taking responsibility to try to figure it out myself.
That's rad.
And so initially, like, I started with an interest in performance and like reading really lay articles on training, then to maximize the results there, starting to learn more about nutrition, and it was a lot more oriented around body composition. But then like you start to learn about how nutrition affects the endocrine system and how like insulin is involved, and then cortisol and these other hormones. And I just went down these long rabbit holes. And I think it was just a slow process over time of the information getting gradually more complicated or detail oriented. And so a lot of, I think what Ray said in that article made sense to me, and it resonated with me, although there were certainly a lot of his articles at that time where when I started to go through them, I didn't quite grasp a lot of the concepts initially.
Who does? I think I've said this before, but if I go through any of his newsletters, I think I'll pick up something I had not picked up previously.
Yeah.
Because the system is so complex that, at least for me, I only have the capacity to think about the things I'm most interested in. And then unfortunately I'll start to like forget other parts of the system that I've like previously learned about. So yeah, for him to have continually think about the big picture is something incredible. But anyways, okay, so you're having these bad experiences with fish oil. You find that article, and then do you ditch fish oil immediately, or what's that situation like?
Yeah, I pretty much ditched it immediately, and those really came back. I didn't really get a lot deeper into any of his articles or that much deeper into much other health-oriented things at the time. And I remember I always felt like I would have maybe 1 or 2 really productive months of the year as far as like reading in my extracurricular. And it was usually around the spring or something where I would just get this this burst or this desire to learn and plow through a bunch of books. And then it would kind of trail off, and I would just keep myself busy with work and training. But as some of those, especially like the training interest faded a little bit for myself, I just had energy available to do other things with that. And so that started to pick up again. And I saw that health was such an integral aspect of performance over the long run that if you just neglected that, it was going to catch up with you. And that, so if you wanted to maximize your potential over the long run, you're going to need to keep your health in check. And that's when it became more interesting. And there are other stories of just like I've had other weird health issues or trying to help my wife with some of her gut issues at the time, or other family members and friends, and kind of.
Sorry, go ahead.
Information like stuff that wouldn't normally be interesting to you is becomes interesting when it's relevant in some way to your life, and I think that's just a thing that's repeated itself a lot, and when you combine that with a desire to seek out information, then its ideas start to accumulate.
Well, I feel like there's another quote from Ray who says, I think he has another one, but the one I'm thinking of is like, things should make no sense until they make the right sense. But I also feel like he has a quote about like, the information should be like a burning question. Like that should be the way it is, you know? And then when somebody is trying to like tell you like something that you're not necessarily interested in, I like, at least for me, I like sideline that information until it's extremely relevant to what I'm thinking about, you know? But yeah. I know from last time that we talked, I feel like have had a lot of similar bizarre health occurrences similar to me, you know, like yeah. I've had such a bizarre list of random like symptoms over the years, and I think that's one of the things that made me more interested in Ray's point of view, because he would drop similar things, and he would say things, and I'd be like, oh my god, I've had that exact same experience, and then he'd try to explain it from like a physiological angle, but when did you think that the bioenergetic point of view, which we can get into, was something to integrate into sports and performance, but also balance that with whatever was generating health?
I would say I didn't necessarily integrate it into my concept of sport and performance for a while. Other than that, being healthy was gonna relate to good performance over the long run. There were little bits here and there where I started to make more connections, or you would read something from health research and see how that would have a performance impact. But then especially in the last 2 years, it's accumulated where, and I think I've been able to narrow it down more to like a pretty clear picture. But literally, like, energy, and some of Ray's, like, the way he describes it, but energy is just the potential to do anything. And I tie it back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well, from classical psychology, but he talks about meeting your kind of needs for food and shelter and security, and then I can't remember the exact steps in the periods, but then it's then you would.
I can bring up.
You're going to pull it up. Yeah.
Keep going though.
But like, you take care of those basics, and if you only have little available, then those are the things that are most important to take care of for you to keep living, basically. But then if you have those taken care of and you have extra resources, then you can start spending that more towards social interactions, relationships, family, doing something more with your life. And then as you get more of those things into place, you would get to self-actualization, right? Or just really realizing your true potential. And I think of that to like a very close parallel, not just in the sense of like food and shelter, but literally just energy. And like, if you have a minimum amount of energy available to do anything, then you're just going to use it to take care of yourself. If you have more energy available than that, and you already taken care of yourself, well, then you can spend that on like taking care of someone else, or taking care of a bigger community, or whatever that may be.
Yeah, I love that. So the basic needs, the physiological needs, the food, water, warmth, rest, the safety needs, security, safety, then the next level up, the psychological needs, intimate relationships, friends, prestige, and feeling of accomplishment, and then the self-actualization phase of achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. Yeah, I'm not saying I've tried. I think I would find myself being creative at certain times, and like ask myself, like, how come you're creative now versus not being creative before? And that's before I ever knew about this concept of hierarchy of needs. So, and then occasionally, like, there are periods of time where I was like obsessed with food, and so like, I guess in Maslow's sense, I was just like such at a bottom low level of being so unstable with my health that I couldn't figure out that part of the picture, but I love good.
Well, like in your conversation with Georgie yesterday, when he was talking about creativity is associated with novelty, and you have to have energy available to be comfortable with the unknown, basically, and and seeking out novelty. But if your energy is low, and a classic example might just be when you're sick, then you don't have the energy available to think about and to process novel information. And so, being sick, what do people do? They want to stay at home. They want familiar people. You want your comfort foods. You watch the same movies over again. It's everything that you already know, because those are like, there's no unknowns. It's a very like low energy kind of cost to doing those kind of things. And that's appropriate when you're not well. It's kind of a safe environment. But if you have a goal of, if you're healthy and you think if you find yourself there and you have a goal of doing more of your life, then it might be good to orient some thoughts around increasing the energy you have available through like healthy means.
Well, on the screen right now, I have Maslow's quote, and it says, "You will either step forward into growth or you will step backward into safety." And when I was moving to Mexico from San Francisco, it was the most like ludicrous, insane idea ever. It made literally like no sense. Like I didn't speak Spanish, and it just made no sense. It was just kind of like a feeling that I should do something. And I was totally uncomfortable with it the whole time that it was like snowballing. And I read on like a Yahoo forum from some random comment, like jump and the net will appear. And I'm not joking, but that like had a strong impact on me. And it's similar to this Abraham Maslow quote. And like, I can't really tell you how terrified I was of like getting on the plane and like coming over here, but it was hugely therapeutic because I think for sure that novelty in that situation and the fact that I didn't die during the whole process and I overcame some like serious fears and things. Like for a while, it was nerve-wracking even to go into a store to try to find something. Like, because I knew somebody would approach me and try to talk to me, and I'd be like, "Oh, mi español es terrible, lo siento." Like, it would just be embarrassing. I'd be embarrassed. Like, and so again, I have so much work to do as a human being, but putting myself in that like extremely uncomfortable situation wasn't that like super fun all the time, but it definitely increased. I guess I hope my growth as an individual. You know.
Yeah, and I think so, and that's just an experience where when you do something like that and it's novel, and then you turn out okay, then you use that to like just be more okay with more novel situations in the future.
Exactly,
and it can happen the other way around for others, right? When it doesn't go well, but.
Okay, so what more of the transition? Like, when do you start incorporating like so-called Ray Pete inspired nutrition or whatever? Because something else I like about you is you are clearly nutrition focused, and so I feel very strongly that if you took those certain nutritional things away from me, I'd have like a really hard time feeling well. It's almost like the supplements are just that they are ancillary to good nutrition, and so I felt that was something else that we were similar.
Yeah, I guess again on my end, like when I decided to delve deeper into it and I was getting really interested, then I just wanted to go full bore and learn everything I could. And I think that that probably comes from some of the mistakes I've made too. But like when I was in my 17, 18, and you would hear about like supplement X is good for pumps or whatever, and
no,
you're like, oh, yeah, exactly, those kind of things, and you're like, oh, that's good for something. I want that thing. I'm going to try that. With the fish oil too, exactly, and then you find out that there's all these other potential negatives with it, and so at some point I felt like if I saw something that was interesting, it was almost irresponsible for me not to do as deep as a dive as I could within reason before kind of placing that within my frame and then making a decision on it. And so,
but why did you feel like that? Well, like, why did you feel like you had to explore the depths of that? Because you had a duty to provide the information, or what?
No, it's just for myself, but like I think the goal of just being my best self, like if there was a way I could improve things with nutrition, like or training, I wanted to do it. And uh, and then just doing that responsibly. And so when I got interested in Ray's stuff, I opened up every one of his newsletter articles in a browser tab, started to make my way through those, and then at some point I came onto the forum, and there's like a couple people with higher quality of posts, like Georgie, and so at one point I opened up his profile, and I just started opening all of his articles in browser tabs, and I think it was a lot. There's probably like 300 things, little posts he'd put up there at that point. But my perspective was like, well, this is going to take a long time, but I better start now. And so I would get home from work in the evenings and just sit down. And that was the advantage of not being on social media too, is I'd get home and just start knocking these off and like saving interesting things to Evernote, and eventually got through it, and then was, like to think better for that. But like we talked about too, at some point I just started to make more of a transition to reading journal articles as they were published, because I started to get more comfortable with my ability to interpret that information and then have sort of my own, I was better able to fit it within my own view and not having to take someone else's opinion on it.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
now I scour.
Yeah, I mean, I know Ray Pete says XYZ, but I think he's just distilling lots of things that I think about down to an easy assimilable form. But I'm like you. I really, if I didn't have like 6,000 notes in my Evernote, really backing up what I thought Ray's general points about energy and stress and things like that, I wouldn't really feel comfortable talking about it. And also, if I'm communicating with somebody via email, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, "Hey, like take my word for it." That's funny. We actually started doing that probably at a similar time, but your knowledge level exceeds mine by like 100 times.
Not that this, I don't even know if I should go into this, but if I look at my Evernote, just from like, what is that? By like default folder, I have 48,000 notes, or like articles I've clipped or something in the last however many years.
Perfect. Eight times the amount I have. That, I mean, yeah, that's admirable. That's insane. Do you? I mean, I think I probably mentioned it on this, but I think, like you said, that was a huge liberation factor for me, because I really did spend an immense amount of time on forums back in the day, like 2000, like 7, 8, 9, probably around there. Like I spent every waking moment on a bodybuilding forum, like Mesomorphosis or All Things Male, or there was one other bodybuilding forum that was really big, anabolicminds.com. And I would be on there all the time. And there were people, there were big people on those forums that everybody would gravitate to get specific information. And, but reading Ray's perspective, and then again, traversing over to Evernote and saying, okay, if Ray is going to say estrogen increases prolactin, I better have like multiple sources confirming that or saying something similar before I just start like going off and saying that too, because like I don't have any experimental background or anything, so I have huge gaps in my knowledge and understanding and things. But again, that speaking of like moving up that pyramid, I think making the nutritional stuff less confusing and more applicable to you by using something like Evernote and collecting interesting information that applies to your health and your specific situation. I think I can think of few things less important than that.
Yeah. And I think at some point, if you really want to nail things down, you really do need to go to a deeper level, because there are so many different factors involved with good health and performance that you can't have one style of eating and possibly meet all of your requirements. And, kind of the lazy, it's not untrue, but the safe thing to say is that, well, just eat a balanced diet or mixed diet in general. And that is sane advice, but people should be more aware of, I guess, the intricacies of what they might be missing or what they might benefit from.
Well, we were trading emails not too long ago about just the supply and demand idea.
Yeah.
And it's something I really do think about often. And I sound like a broken record on this. But when you're trying to increase your metabolic rate, whether it be calcium containing foods, or you're starting to eat more ripe fruits or what have you, or you're taking vitamin D, or you're doing anything, you're going to need more nutrition, and I don't think there are many ways to go about getting that nutrition. I'd be interested in your specific thoughts, but that's why I see the liver and the oysters as such essential foods, because they cover so many different bases. And I think it'd be hard to obtain the specific nutrition in those foods otherwise.
Yeah, I think it is. And I've gone back and forth over the years about being more pro supplement or anti supplement. Pro, probably these days leading more towards the pro side, because I do think if you're really conscious about those things and eating nutrient dense foods, you can make a pretty good diet out of that. But that doesn't necessarily equate with what's optimal. And one example is if you want to effectively use carbs for energy, you need B1 for the enzyme PDH, pyruvate dehydrogenase. And if you don't, it's more likely to be shunted towards lactate. But the amount of B1 that prevents a deficiency disease, or beriberi or Wernicke's encephalopathy, is not necessarily saying all of those enzymes are going to be have the cofactor when you need it, and you're truly generating the maximum amount of energy. And the amount of B1 that might do that, it could be unrealistic to achieve from food. And that's not to say there aren't risks of using supplements and using higher amounts of things, because I guess the basic thing to think about there is that our body is there's a lot of different chemical reactions going on, and a basic thing you would learn in chemistry is if you just supply more of one reactant, that reaction will proceed forward faster. But if you've only provided one of those, then eventually whatever else is feeding into that is going to become limiting. And so there could be circumstances where, normally people would say if you're meeting the minimum of these things, there's no risk for deficiency. But if someone were to supplement with one thing grossly in excess, it's possible that you could create relative deficiencies in other nutrients and have issues because of that.
Well, let's get into this, because your experience of lifting and exerting yourself, you have that experience much more than I do. And so you probably noticed things about your specific needs that I'm completely oblivious to. Is that where you've noticed that supplements are pretty important when you're doing things like chronic weightlifting and things?
I wouldn't. I don't think I would have noticed it as much when I was more training and the strength and everything was my goal then, because I think partly because of my eating, and then maybe partly just the demand of that, I was probably operating at just a lower capacity mentally, and I wouldn't really have realized what I was missing. And then I feel like my nutrition and things have gotten better, and like I'm much more regularly feeling more creative and energetic, and a lot more extroverted than I used to feel. Now, if I do a hard training session, especially if I'm like trying to restrict my eating in order to keep my weight down or whatnot, then it can hit me pretty hard, and I'll feel sluggish after that. And then they're like, generally my health is pretty good these days, but they're a little like, there's always just minor little things I'm troubleshooting, like bits of dry skin or whatnot, or patches. And I find that when I do train heavier and more consistently, then things like that come up. And it's, I know there's sort of controversial views on some of the genetic testing. Like Georgie and others have legitimate concerns about sending your data to those companies and who has access to it and whatnot. I did it when it was early on, and I was excited about it. And I do think that while genetics aren't by no means the end all be all, they do tell you a little bit about predispositions that might influence your nutrient requirements. And, so Chris Masterjohn talks about certain genes or combination of genes can influence your choline requirements quite significantly. So I think the RDA might be 400 milligrams a day. A lot of people don't meet that, but then if you have some of these variations, that could double or triple, and then that's going to affect a lot of different things with muscle and brain function, blood sugar control, and so that information can be useful. And I have a variation that, and maybe this ties into the skin, but where I don't, I'm less effective at converting plant vitamin A's, the carotenoids, into active vitamin A. So just something that potentially increases the probability of me having an issue with vitamin A if I'm not on top of that.
And okay, so let's talk about your self-experimentation, and then your extensive thirst for knowledge, and then how you apply that to these elite athletes, because that is something that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that aspect I don't really apply to the athletes. My role is
more of the exercise side of things.
Yeah. So I mean, and I don't really have a role with the nutrition with regard to the athletes, and we have a dietitian who does that, and I'm just supportive in that end and relaying the same information. But on the energetic side with the athletes, some of that, I guess, those even this year were coming about towards the beginning of the year when I was trying to explore some different ways for testing and measurement, and ways to improve that with the athletes, and things that might relate to I was thinking about at the time a master's project. So I was reviewing a lot of biomechanics, and I guess in that process of like looking at the testing and what we're measuring, and we have all these different ways of doing it, and you'll get measurements in all these different variables, like in volts, and then you're converting things to newtons. And I graduated in 2010 and hadn't reviewed a lot of that in a long time. So I was going back and then just putting some deeper thought into what all of that really meant. And I think especially on the force and velocity side, it started to make sense for me to think of things from an energetic perspective. And so, like, typically if you evaluate an athlete doing a jump or doing the lift and you had some sort of measurement on the force plate, you might be able to get an idea of what their force velocity profile is. So if you Google like force velocity curves, you'll just see that there's generally an inverse relationship between the two, meaning that like the faster you're able to move a load, or the faster the velocity you can create, generally that's associated with moving less load. So if I'm lifting heavier, that's going to be slower than if I'm lifting something lighter, basically. Okay. And so you can look at that profile, and most sports are associated with more requirements on the velocity side of things or on the power, and being able to, but looking at that shape of the curve might give you some insights into how you might adjust your training for that athlete. Like, do you have a very strong athlete who can lift a lot of weights, but they're even when you reduce the load a lot, they just don't seem that fast, and then do a more velocity oriented program? Or do you have someone who seems quick but doesn't have the ability to move a lot of weight?
And this is mostly related to speed skating, is that right?
Well, for any sport, really, but the context I was applying it in was more related to those athletes.
And then it's probably a dumb word, but like explosiveness, is that like the goal for us, or it's endurance as well, right? How many laps do they do?
So speed skating has a whole range of distances that they compete in. The shortest being 500 meters, which will take somewhere around 35 seconds or on the low end of that. And then they have 1,000-meter event, 1,500-meter event, 3,000 for the women, 5K for the men, and then 10K. And so there's even, like, compared to track sprinting, where the 100-meter, we're talking 10 seconds, and that's a sprint distance. The sprint distance for speed skating is definitely involves more of an endurance component relative to that.
In high school, I did the 800 because I thought it would be the easiest, and that's like one of the hardest things to run. It's like sprinting 2 laps. I want to kill myself after every single race. So continue. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So typically we would think of, we'd associate power with sprinters, and then considering endurance athletes as low power. And that is true if you're comparing the two. But even if you look, just the concept of power is how much energy can you transfer in a given time frame. And so you can think of any task that you want to do, any movement task, as having an energy cost associated with it. So you could like look at the weight on the bar, and if you're doing a squat, and what the distance is, moving it up and down, and figure out the energy cost of that. You could do a 100-meter race, and knowing there's more details there, but with your body mass and wind resistance and some other factors, start to get an idea of the cost. Similar thing in speed skating, with wind resistance and different frictions on the ice playing into that. And obviously, the longer the distance, that's going to add into the cost. So even for endurance athletes, while their power is relative is low relative to a sprinter, the person who wins a marathon will still have, they'll be the fastest of the people competing in the marathon, or the most powerful. Not necessarily in terms of like their raw abilities, because that doesn't, having the raw ability of power doesn't mean that you're able to translate that effectively. You know, like an example would be is if you had a race car, you can test how much horsepower the engine has by hooking up the dynamometer directly to the engine, and it might read 500 or something. But you can also do the same thing, measuring the horsepower at the rear wheels and a roller. Mm-hmm. And then you would have losses through the drivetrain because of that. So two cars might both have 500 horsepower engines, but one might read 450 at the wheels and another one might be 400 because of a lot of losses. And so you can have an athlete that's very powerful, but then because of poor technique, where they're wasting a lot of energy that's not effectively moving them forward, then their, I guess, effective power, quote unquote, would be low. But just the point I wanted to get across was that regardless of whether you're like a sprinter or endurance athlete, how much energy you can transfer in a given amount of time is still relative, is very important to your performance.
Well, does that relate to the slow twitch versus fast twitch muscle fibers?
Yeah, a little bit. Just in general, fast twitch fibers have a much higher capability to transfer energy. So they are more powerful by nature.
I have your graphic. I have your graphic up here. Do you want to explain what the difference is, like, quickly?
Oh, that's on the.
It's the can we use cell biology and bioenergetics to predict whether your muscles to develop and more slow or fast twitch properties?
And is that the sort of graphic with the little flow of the cells?
Yeah, I love it. How do you make these?
I didn't make that one. Probably inappropriately clipped that one from a journal article, but it's referenced in the bottom, if that means anything. But that graphic in particular is just talking about how muscle cells in general develop, and then how the low oxygen environment influences them to develop one way or another, and gets into those concepts of proliferation and differentiation. So that graphic goes, it's a little bit of a different topic, but slow twitch muscles in general, they can't spend as fast, but they're more ideal at using like fat, and so they can just go longer for before they fatigue, basically. But you know, the ideal for an athlete would just be to have a situation where you could spend as much energy as possible and last as long as possible, regardless of what your distance is. And then, so some of my just thoughts around that were trying to orient, like, how can you make yourself as efficient at making energy and spending it fast and not fatiguing.
Do you think about that when you're training? Like, for example, do you give any thought of like the breathlessness or recuperation during the exercise? Is that something you're thinking about?
Like talking about some of the suggestions,
or rather, like and I'd be interested in your specific point of view, but the idea, isn't it like concentric exercise promotes the creation of mitochondria, where eccentric tends to do the opposite?
I haven't seen much research on the effect of like concentric or eccentric on the mitochondria in muscles, but in general, eccentric exercise has the potential to be more damaging, especially because you can lift heavier loads. And then if you're lifting heavier loads, and especially when you're not accustomed to it, or if you just do a lot of volume, then when you do that damage, it's probably not conducive to maintaining a lot of the structure in that moment. And I guess it used to be more thought of that muscle damage was a mechanism that promoted hypertrophy and cell growth, and they're always debating these things, but now they say most would assume it's not really necessary, and so you can get the stimulus for growth without the damage. And if you do a lot of damage, you're mostly just delaying your recovery.
Can you say that again? Because I think it's really important. And people I don't have a strong opinion about this one way or the other, but that does seem to be like sacred muscle building knowledge, that to build muscle, you are tearing or breaking down that tissue. But what you're saying is that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I think there was where they basically suggested three main mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, which were tension, so just stressing the muscle with load, metabolic stress as the second one, so things like just stresses that would reduce the oxygen supply, be more likely to make lactate, would be a stimulus for growth. And then the third one being muscle damage, just that damage being a stimulus for recovery. But then Chris Beardsley's a researcher, and he posts a lot of nice little infographics on strength and conditioning. I think his current opinion is more so that the damage isn't really necessary. It's more just the tension, and usually, or often, that tension can be associated with damage, but that the damage just isn't really necessary. And then he doesn't think the metabolic stress plays a large role either. Not totally sold on that, but I think, like Ray talks about, like reducing the oxygen supply does tend to shift cells towards that more proliferative mode, where they're more likely to kind of divide and multiply and grow, and so there probably is a little bit of an effect there.
That's interesting. I know I'm bouncing around here, but have you looked into that idea that the muscles are creating steroids such as testosterone? And like that was one of the reasons Ray said that having large muscles was actually an important thing.
I haven't looked into that so much, but I think there's definitely some relationships between hormone metabolism and muscle growth. And I mean, obviously, like there's bodybuilders that use exogenous, kind of outside the body hormones that promote growth, but it's been contentious whether the release of hormones during exercise contributes to growth at all. And there's not really any good relationships there when like exercise does or doesn't cause you to release testosterone. Sometimes cortisol and can be a positive indicator of like muscle growth and adaptation, and they basically just think it's signaling that you had a stressful workout and that you did a lot of work, and it was the work that was going to contribute to the growth. But I think like Georgie's mentioned, they're measuring those hormones in the blood, and there is a relationship between hormones in the blood and hormones in the cell typically, but it's probably more nuanced than most people give it credit for. And then I think even things like protein and leucine, where people are just thinking of that purely in terms of building blocks. I think leucine has the capacity to be metabolized into cholesterol,
Oh,
and then
to
yeah, and then
acetyl CoA, isn't that then that's the precursor for cholesterol synthesis?
yeah, yeah, and then your cholesterol itself is associated with muscle growth, and so there's probably um, some links that's happening in the internal environment there between hormones and growth, but I don't know much about the muscles themselves secreting hormones.
For yourself, because you maintain such a large, excellent physique. What are the things that you are, or you think have historically helped you maintain the aesthetic that you were going for, and
Yeah,
function?
I don't like I think once you had it or have had it, it's pretty easy to maintain. And I remember it being a pretty arduous process to put on muscle in the first place. But then, yeah, it's just never seemed that like it's been a pretty minimal stimulus to maintain things. And I think part of that comes from good nutrition as well. I think basically if your body's making enough energy and getting enough nutrients, then it doesn't really have much of a reason to break muscle down.
But you think?
And
Sorry, go ahead.
well, even the simple things that like getting enough of the electrolytes like sodium and calcium, magnesium can play into that. I think a lot more than people give it credit for, because if you're not eating enough salt, and aldosterone raises, and that will have negative influences on muscle. And I think low sodium can also elevate prolactin, which might lower testosterone. If you're not getting enough calcium, you might have elevations in parathyroid hormone and PTHRP and prolactin and other things that are also kind of catabolic to muscle. If you're not getting enough magnesium, you just might not be as relaxed in general in a way that's contributing to muscle tension and activity that's burning energy and making it harder to maintain things.
For the athletes, do you have access to testing and things like that, or is that outside your realm?
They do some blood work, but it's fairly minimal. And part of that is just like the reality of the budgets with amateur sport. So it would be nice if there was a budget to do more, but there isn't.
And then do you have any kind of training maxim or philosophy when you're training with people, or is it like, I guess, how do you size up an athlete? Like, what needs to be done? Is it mostly measuring and then kind of going from there of what exercises would correct any deficit or something like that?
Yeah. So we go through a process. Basically, you do a needs analysis of the sport and of the athlete. So, like, what is going to make a good athlete in that sport and in that event? You do a gap analysis. So, saying, like, for this person you have in front of you, what's missing from that ideal or where you think they need to be. And then you just make a plan to close those gaps. And so we have a large support team where I have a role with strength and conditioning. We have a physiologist, a dietitian, sports psychologist, physiotherapists, and so forth. And we all try to contribute to that. On the strength side, like I was saying, we do have some ways to get an idea of their kind of raw force and power abilities. And that helps identify some of the gaps there. But then a lot of it, more of it might be on the movement side as well. So like if you take a video of an athlete and you're noticing that they're moving in a certain way that may not be ideal, there could be a lot of different things that feed into that. Maybe they just don't know what the ideal is, and then it's just a case of awareness and giving the right cues. Maybe they are aware, but they literally don't have the sort of passive or active mobility to get into the positions that they need to. And then there might be some interventions for that, and you might have assessments, like musculoskeletal assessments, to see if they do have that capacity. And I think that's an important point where it can be a really frustrating process for both athletes and coaches when the coaches are telling them to do something and they're not executing it. And then, the athlete gets frustrated because they can't do it, and the coach gets frustrated because the athlete's not doing it. But if they just don't have the ability to do it, then if you can identify what that gap is, then it just makes it a much more positive and productive environment. So identifying some of those mobility limitations might be some of the first piece, but then it could also be like strength and endurance in certain muscle groups or chains of muscle groups that would allow you to hold those positions. And the balance between different things that might sort of tell your body's preference for moving one way or another. And there's not a good test for all of that, so some of it is just like a process of reasoning and experimenting and trying to keep records on it.
Is there a big win that you can think of that somebody was having some problem and you tweaked something and it really changed the way they moved or performed?
Yeah, but I don't know if I can give any specific examples. But I'll give you like a very generic example. Like a lot of Olympic weightlifters, or if someone's just squatting in general, if you want to stay like very upright in your squatting, that's a position that requires a lot of strength in your quadriceps, sort of in the front of your legs. You generally have to be able to push your knees very far forward in order to get low with an upright back. Whereas the more you tilt your torso forward, the more you can utilize muscles in your sort of posterior chains, so your butt, your hamstrings, your low back. And people are more often stronger in those muscles. So often, even if someone's trying to do an upright squat, you might see they're able to go down like that when it's easier, but then when they're trying to come up, their hips kind of pop up and then they stand up like that. So, and then in weightlifters, like you'll see similar things if they're doing like a snatch or a clean and jerk where they're lifting the bar to their shoulders or overhead. Sometimes it would be ideal to have a relatively more upright position to minimize sort of the horizontal displacement of the bar. But sometimes you'll see those hip pops up again, and then it makes them more likely to kind of loop the bar around when they're doing those lifts. Now, if someone has a balance like that and they don't really have that balance in mind, and they just think that they need to get stronger in general, and they train all their muscles equally, then they may get stronger, but their body's still going to want to utilize the stronger muscles for the job. And so it's still going to move in those ways. And so if someone has an imbalance like that, you can't train everything equally. You would need to train them in an imbalanced fashion where you, say, get their anterior chains, like their quad, stronger, while you, quote unquote, neglect the backside. And then once that balance is different, then their body's just going to want to move in in what you would consider a more ideal pattern for that particular thing.
I take all my weightlifting advice from Rich Piana, but I'm going to consider what you said. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Right.
there are a few other topics that you did want to get into, and so probably use this as an opportunity. Did you want to talk about, what were the things? It was on this.
I had a bunch of list of things here,
And
but
by the way, everybody, we are taking super chats, so if you want to take advantage of Mr. Simpson's knowledge, please leave a super chat. And towards the end, that's when we'll read them. And yeah, and of course, all the super chats go to. I didn't check with you, but is it okay if we donate them to Ray, Nick?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. It might be a little bit hard for me to just talk about kind of the post I made on first, but it was just when I was digging into some of those concepts and just thinking about really what force is, you'll usually get a pretty nebulous answer about just relating to being strong or something, where someone with power is going to be able to move faster. And I think depending on what units you use, if you look at it from the perspective of energy, and instead of thinking of like, and this may not be for this audience, but instead of thinking of force as like mass times acceleration, if you think of it as a joule per meter, or basically the rate of energy expenditure per unit distance, similar to how like power is the rate of energy expenditure per unit time, and just orient your thoughts around energy, then I think that makes it easier to do a bit of that needs analysis more rationally, where you can think of tasks having an energy cost, an athlete having a certain amount of energy available in a given energy system. They'll have a power or a certain rate that they can transfer that in time, and then based on what load they're trying to move in, like, and their efficiencies and how good they are technically, then that will either translate into them doing something fast, and or the opposite of moving slow, but what we would normally call like someone who appears forceful in that context. And it's just taking it down to the basics of energy supply, the rate of transfer, and then any sort of efficiencies or inefficiencies in that process.
Well, because I'd be interested in your experience because you have control of all the variables for yourself. But I've told this story 100 times. But when I moved to San Francisco, I hooked up with a personal trainer who I asked not to kill me every single session, but then he proceeded to try to kill me every single session. But the thing I noticed was that if I took aspirin before, I could literally like cruise through his workout, and then he'd have me do pull-ups to failure at the end. And I would like, when I wouldn't take aspirin, I'd be able to do like 1 or 2 or 3 and then just be totally done. But when I would take the aspirin, I could do like 10. And so again, literally nothing had changed except for that aspirin. And also I could, like, the aspirin always has made me feel like I was like taking in more oxygen. And that's how it felt during that whole exercise process. But I have no idea if there's anything to do with force. but I am like, I imagine those small tweaks can have a really big impact on your performance.
Yeah. I haven't seen a lot on aspirin and strength or like anti-inflammatories or painkillers, but definitely pain will inhibit your ability to express like your strength and your power. And so numbing that a little bit is going to allow you to do better, aside from like any metabolic effect it might have. And there's a fair bit of research on, or at least a couple papers on Tylenol and Advil, even just using higher doses of normal painkillers and endurance exercise can allow people to push themselves further because they're not sensing that pain. And then at the more extreme end, like tramadol and drugs like that are a problem in professional cycling because people are using them for similar reasons. I personally I guess I like the idea of aspirin, but I just don't seem to react well to it anymore. Seems to irritate my nose or my mucous membranes, and I've tried troubleshooting that a little bit, but it seems to be pretty consistent these days. And I have a few ideas around that, but I feel pretty good without it, so I don't worry about it too much.
I got that idea from Rob Turner, and so he had posted like maybe a small battery of studies about using the aspirin before some exercise and blunting the maybe cortisol and aldosterone. And so again, I have no idea what was going on, but that's again, from my extremely limited experience, seemed to help. But again, this guy was he was doing like a CrossFit type workout, and it was just like killing me. I'd be so sore the next few days, I wouldn't be able to really do anything.
There's some research that some of those inflammatory mediators will like promote the adaptation and the recovery of the workout, and then they usually in the studies they're using like maximal daily doses of those, but then they find that does seem to blunt the adaptations to the training. So if your only goal is to do like the workout and maybe burn some energy and to recover quickly, it may not be as much of a problem. But if your goal is to keep getting better, then it might hurt some aspects of that response.
Well, we were kind of talking about it earlier. Like, do you think, you know how some bodybuilders look like waterlogged? Do you think there's a way to build muscle that's kind of like maybe a harmful or unphysiological way? And then there's a way that's helpful, because some bodybuilders, maybe it's the drugs they're on or whatever, but look so swollen, and they're just so waterlogged in their muscles.
Yeah, some of that might come from it definitely could come from drugs.
Turinabol.
And, yeah, or whatever, growth hormones or estrogen related things. But if they're doing training that is doing a lot of damage and having a lot of muscle metabolic stress, I think usually bodybuilders might be training with higher reps than I think Ray is talking about. Any kind of fatigue will induce swelling in the muscles, and guys doing training usually think of that more of a good thing, like you did a workout and then you have a pump for a few days after. But probably if you are doing crushing workouts with a lot of volume, your muscles will be swollen as they recover from that. And if you're training 5, 6, 7 days a week, then maybe you just look like that continually.
Do you give any thought to bag breathing in between reps or anything for yourself or athletes, or how do you know that you've pushed somebody too far? Do you monitor that when you're working with somebody?
Usually in the weight room, depends on the time of the year, but we're more focused on the power aspect usually, or the quality of movement. Mm-hmm. So usually they're doing other training that would push more the endurance side of things. And then so when they're in the weight room, we're not really pushing that breathlessness much.
You're keeping an eye on that when you're working with somebody, where they're breathing?
Where they're breathing,
or rather how?
Yeah, I'm paying attention to their effort level for sure. Mm-hmm. And I don't have one of the biggest predictors of your athlete's ability to perform is probably just how many days of training they're going to miss to injury or illness. And so you don't need to go to failure or anything in order to get the benefit we're looking for from training most of the time. And so I'm generally trying to make sure that they're working hard and putting an honest effort and challenge themselves, but making sure they're not going overboard. So usually, not too breathless or anything.
Well, that's interesting what you just said. So the time, if they get injured, the time that they're out relates to their general fatigue level, you think?
Well, it would relate to their performance at the end of the year. Just because, as long as they can handle it, then more training is more opportunity to work on the skills that you need. And to develop yourself further. So if you're spending time at home injured or sick, then that's not very productive time for moving yourself forward.
Maybe you can't answer this, but do you get yelled at if an athlete gets injured? Is that something you're really not trying to do?
I wouldn't say I get yelled at, but it's definitely not a goal of mine. And yeah.
Okay, another top.
Like you can go too far in the other direction too, right? Where you're so worried about hurting people that you just don't allow them to get any work in.
Yeah.
Or you do like fluffy things. So I think there's definitely a balance there in terms of like there's going to be an inherent risk to certain activities, but that just means to get the most out of it and to minimize the risk, you need to keep the quality as high as possible.
Well, just my juvenile understanding of everything, like with something like starting strength, the or what was his name, Ripito or whatever, it was always like add in 2.5 pounds like every week. Is that similar to what you're doing? Like you want to be progressing in some direction?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I don't think you can often be so linear like that, especially when you have an athlete where the gym is not their only training modality.
Yeah.
So when you have a lot of other training stresses and other life stresses in general, and you're not just someone like doing that workout program 3 to 4 times a week and then you're recovering the rest of the time, you can't expect to add 2.5 pounds each time. And I try to educate the athletes, and I want them to have the mindset of that quality of execution. And so that means them being aware of like what their body is capable of that day. So there's I don't want them to focus on the load as much as, say, a certain feeling and execution.
Yeah, because form sounds so important to what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, brother. Okay, so we're... sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, this is a little bit of a different topic, but we put it in the title, so I figure I may as well say something about methylation.
I was just going to ask you.
Oh, yeah. I'd say that's probably one area where there's sort of people in that repeat community overlook, and I think it maybe has a bit of a bad rap because a lot of the processes in there are associated with cell proliferation, whereas like yourself and Georgie's and others will talk about more of the benefits of like a differentiated cell and an oxidative metabolism as opposed to a reductive metabolism. But I think it's important to keep in context that what gives anything potential is a difference. And so like a magnet or a cell or a battery. Like if you think of a muscle cell, for example, where the resting membrane potential might be negative 70 millivolts, it's that difference that gives you the potential to do something. And so if Ray, especially in some of his recent articles, has talked about how the majority of people might be more likely to be in a state of reductive stress versus oxidative stress, and then how many people could improve their health through increasing oxidative metabolism. But there's probably a point where if you push oxidative metabolism too far and you don't balance that out with some sort of reductive capacity, then that is going to cause problems.
If you push things too much in the loss of electrons and you don't balance it with the fuel, right? So the addition of
Well, it's just like so more simply, like we talked about the concept of just having a fast metabolism in general is going to increase your nutrient requirements.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned there were some older studies on like hyper, where they tended to die much quicker than normal rats, and just feeding them different nutrients in excess of the normal diet allowed them to live longer. And one of those nutrients in those studies was leucovorin, which is a form of B9 or folic acid. And basically, like if you have a fast metabolism, you're driving every process forward and you're renewing tissues more often, and that's going to require more building blocks. And part of what it takes to build cells is going to be things like B9 and B12 and B6 and things that are sometimes avoided in that community for fear that, like of course, in the extreme example of cell proliferation cancer, you might want to minimize things that contribute to that process. But in a healthy individual, like if you're just driving things forward but not supplying what you need, then that's going to cause its own set of problems.
Well, let's step
that might
back.
Be distinct.
Sorry, go ahead. Let's step back for a second. What is methylation? Like, why would that? Why is it important?
Yeah, so it's just like you could consider energy metabolism and the citric acid cycle as one pathway in the body that we've delineated, where making energy is the main goal of that. Methylation is named because it involves the transfer of methyl groups between molecules, but it's a pathway that's involved in making creatine, in making the myelin coating of your nerves, in DNA and RNA, and all these other things that our body needs. And especially on even tying it more purely to energy metabolism, like creatine is a source of immediate energy in your cells, and 60 to 80% of the capacity for methylation just goes towards making creatine. And so if you, are you good?
Can you still see me and hear me?
Daniel?
Oh, there you are. Can you see me?
Yeah, you're just breaking up a little bit there.
Yeah, same with you.
Yeah. But if you ignore the things you need for that pathway, then you're diminishing your ability to make energy in sort of a cheap and effective way. And we also talked about, this was, one of the weird issues I inflicted on myself, but, there are some talks of the dangers of iron. And I also think it's, beneficial to donate blood, but a really good way to cut off your ability to supply oxygen and energy to the cells in your body is to become anemic. And sort of some of the classical things involved with red blood cell production are the nutrients involved in methylation. Cells that are proliferating very quickly, the blood cells in your bone marrow, so B6 and B12 and B9 and B2.
And one of the core things about methylation is getting rid of homocysteine or not producing it. Is that right?
Yeah, so when your body metabolizes the amino acid methionine, it produces homocysteine, which can have some negative effects on your vasculature. So there are a couple of ways the body can process that, and it has a few ways of recycling that back in to methionine, or it can get rid of it through another pathway that involves sulfur. But either way, if you're lacking the things that you need to metabolize it, and that elevates homocysteine, that will cause a bunch of problems, especially if you're eating a lot of methionine.
And that's like B6 and B12. I remember those being some like the big
players,
like you mentioned.
And B2. And then there are some genetic variations that make some of those enzymes less effective. But one of the reasons I thought it might be interesting for you is I think it does have a role with hair, and I was kind of looking across some of your articles, and
oh no,
yeah, and just like in terms of, I think energy metabolism is a huge facet of that in general, but then just sort of the title of your first book there, Hair Like a Fox. As far as the fox part, there's not as much good research on humans, but there's a lot of research on like the nutrients that promote like wool growth in sheep and goats for cashmere and wool and minks and everything. And essentially hair has a very high cysteine content, and which your body can make from methionine. And there are some research that to an extent there's almost a linear relationship between the amount of like methionine and cysteine that you might feed them and the amount or thickness of the hair that they grow.
Well, you're getting into a territory that I've read about, but again, I've never been able to put the pieces together of like the cross-linking of the sulfur, the specific anatomy of the hair follicle. And so that's like, I have older books by a guy named Montagna, who is like this just epic hair loss researcher, not necessarily just a hair person in general, but they talk about in intricate detail things about the nature of hair growth in animals and humans. But again, my knowledge level just isn't there to put the pieces together. And also some of the articles, I'm thinking of one specifically on my website, is like totally wrong. Like I have completely got it backwards. I think the one where I talk about the pentose phosphate pathway one is just like, I should literally take it off my website. But again, the only reason I ever got to that idea was thinking about prolactin, and that wasn't necessarily a Ray Peat idea. That was actually a guy named Brian Simonis from a website called Immortal Hair had talked about prolactin probably being more important than DHT and testosterone. And I knew what prolactin was, but I didn't know like what controlled it. And then when Ray was saying, hey, hypothyroidism or deficiency of calcium or deficiency of vitamin D or a deficiency of salt or hypotonic tissue, these are the things that increase prolactin. And I was like, oh my God, I think this guy actually knows what he's talking about. And so, but then I completely forgot, but you forwarded me that paper about the white matter hyperintensities.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things I've heard in the last like 5 years, I think. And that connecting possibly to hypertension, and that if there's anything to like hang your hat on about like pattern hair loss, I feel like it's hypertension, because and arterial stiffness in general.
Yeah. And so that was one of the other links where there's a condition called like subacute combined degeneration,
Uh-huh.
but it's basically just like a demyelinating condition that's often associated with B12 or methyl donor deficiencies. And so those hyperintensities are seen in that condition. And so it's something that ties that pathway of methylation to white matter hyperintensities, and again to hair, and then the homocysteine as a vascular issue in terms of. Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna point out a couple of the other links, but you had the article like the centrality of the liver, and one of the biggest ways to induce sort of a fatty liver disease in animals is just making them deficient in methionine and choline. And then as far as character armor, like methylation have a big transmitter reduction. And the G6 PDH, like you just mentioned, that taking down that article on the pentose phosphate pathway, but it is involved in cell proliferation generally, which methionine supports.
Well, here's a question though. Could you, if you were eating 100 grams of protein, would it really even be possible to be deficient in methionine? So I think, I don't serve to defend everything Ray is saying, but it's like, it's hard to avoid it, and I think maybe the point just being to find a source of glycine or rather gelatin to like balance it, because you're not going to escape the methionine, right?
Yeah, I guess it's but that's kind of the question is like you just have to look at the different possibilities and then sort of go down the list of like what you're getting and then what it could be. And I would imagine though that like hair is probably a lesser priority to the body than things like your myelin coating and neurotransmitters and making creatine. And so I would imagine if the demand for any of those things is like greater than normal, that what methionine you do have is probably shunted towards more critical things.
Well, I was going to interrupt earlier and say I'm fairly certain I have at least one paper saying that the group tested of those experiencing hair loss did have higher homocysteine, and again, it's like not controversial that the I think I forget the researcher's name, but there are at least a few papers talking about higher levels of cholesterol, and so again, I mean. The brain was just the coup de. The paper you sent me was the coup de grace of the connectedness of everything, and so that's why I was. And again, it renewed my interest in the subject and similarly that idea that the nitric. I'd be interested in your take on this, but the nitric oxide promoting hair growth, dangerous style versus the physiological way of growing hair with carbon dioxide. And so that was actually another, I'm so glad I never finished a book, because I'd literally be so upset that I really didn't have these major pieces of the puzzle in place. And so, and that nitric oxide video was inspired by Ray. Like somebody asked Ray about finasteride, and Ray said, I think it grows hair by promoting systemic stress. And I was like, okay, I've never heard that before. That's interesting. And then I think I cycled through my notes, and the evidence is, from what I can tell, is not super clear or anything, but that inhibiting 5-AR does promote the inducible nitric oxide form. And also, I mean, maybe if you just inhibit the androgens, the estrogen will promote nitric oxide just in general. And so that idea of promoting vasodilation, regrowing hair, but also finasteride having all these horrendous effects actually was extremely, I mean, I don't know if it's right, but for me, it was like a very helpful thing because I couldn't really explain that at all. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think like we talked about last time, I definitely agree that, like, at least in theory, those medications are probably not the right choice for most people, but certain tissues of the body, like hair and then reproductive tissues, have a much higher rate of cell proliferation. They're more reductive environments. And maybe that was one example where, an excess oxidative environment was contributing to poorer hair health, and those medications made a more reductive environment that benefited that area.
Okay.
But then detrimentally pushed all these other tissues in your body to a more reductive state when they didn't need it, and with the downsides of all of that. But like more generally, my kind of point was that and I went into too many details there, but there's a huge health community around like methylation and optimizing those pathways, and probably lots of truths to be seen there, while it's not like the answer to everything. And I think there's a lot of truths to optimizing pathways of energy metabolism, but then a lot of people have just left this other piece of the puzzle out there. And I think there's probably a lot of benefit to be had by just taking some aspects of both of those for a good perspective on what might affect certain health issues.
Fair enough. Straight from the source. Do you want? I think we have at least one or two super chat questions. We're approaching about 2 hours, so it's been a total pleasure. Okay, so let's jump to these. And if you guys have any super chats for Nick, now is definitely the time. Okay, so we're blessed with 2 super chats. Drew F just has $1 super chat. Thank you so much, Drew. And no question. And DBO514, hey brother, for Canadian $5, he says, hey Nicholas, were you ever aware of biofeedback training? It involves testing ROM to determine exercises, and it makes sense from an energetic point of view.
I'm not familiar with ROM.
Yeah,
other than
DBO,
like range of motion. That's probably a different analogy.
DBO, if you want to clarify, I'll ask more. Wasn't there a question on the Kyle episode that you wanted to talk about? Maybe the lactate threshold? Maybe? No?
Oh, yeah. Someone asked, like, if you could improve your lactate tolerance with weight training. Mm-hmm. And that was just one of those ones with, there's, a lot of context that would be important to answer that question, but probably yes, especially if you're at like a lower place in your training to begin with. Would it be the most efficient way to do it? Probably not, but what improves your ability to tolerate lactate is either you can just make more energy in general, so you have more mitochondria, or you have more nutrients that allow you to make energy quickly, and so you just don't need to go there. And there are a lot of factors that relate to that. If you're exposed to lactate and your body produces more of that lactate dehydrogenase enzyme to metabolize it, that would improve your ability to tolerate it. And so it would really just be a question of if you were going for the latter approach of doing your training in a way to expose yourself to lactate for long enough to have that stimulus, and you could do that with weights, it just wouldn't be very pleasant. It's not usually very pleasant.
In your guys' facility, do you guys do like the cryotherapy that's so popular right now, or anything to mimic altitude or anything like that?
No, we don't.
What is your opinion on cryotherapy? It seems like all the rage.
I haven't looked much into the whole body cryotherapy, but a little bit into cold baths generally, and I've seen a little bit that they might inhibit the adaptations to the training.
Mm-hmm.
And like if some people find a cold bath or I guess cryotherapy relaxing, then there's probably some benefits to that. But I haven't seen the strong evidence that they would benefit the recovery at all per se. And if anything, I would veer more towards the heat side of things.
Well, I mean, I know, I talked to Ray, and I hit him up specifically for like, what is the cold doing to the tissue specifically? And I was like, is it deactivating pyruvate dehydrogenase? And he's like, no, it's just stopping everything from working.
Yeah.
And so I was like, man, I mean, but maybe does that like numb? Why do so many athletes do it? Is it's not specifically cryotherapy, but like ice baths? Do you think is it having some kind of maybe backwards effect that's like a misinterpretation?
Well, I think it's literally like slowing the rate of reactions in those tissues,
Mm-hmm.
and it's some of those reactions that would drive inflammatory processes and and then some of those processes feed forward so that you get more swelling and inflammation in the tissue. And yes, there are some circumstances where that can be excess and detrimental, but it probably does help bring. It's like the flare that's kind of bringing resources to that tissue for recovery. So if you put ice on it and you slow things down and you stop flow of blood and immune cells in that area, there will be less inflammation and it might feel better in that moment, but whether that's actually better for the recovery of the tissue or not.
It kind of, you're totally right. It kind of reminds me of that. What was that surgeon who like cut a layer of skin and then he put anti-inflammatory or anesthetizing agent on it. Then he cut another layer and then he put it on. This is a Ray story, but he said the signals never went to the brain that like the tissue is being operated on. And so it was actually a way of surgery that was far less stressful, but it was just kind of tricking the body into thinking that it was okay. Okay, we have a clarification from DBO. He says, we got another super chat. DBO says, basically it involved testing ROM by reaching for your toes, and that would tell you if the exercise was appropriate. It was a guy named Adam Glass who made it popular around 2010, 2011. With hindsight, I've come to realize that it made sense because a fully energized muscle can relax fully, and therefore general muscular tension will be lower. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, yeah, what he's saying about the energy and the muscle relaxation, definitely. I'm just not familiar with the biofeedback aspect. But I do think that's something for people to be aware of, and that I've brought up, is that often when you have, the extreme example of muscle stiffness, kind of rigor mortis, like people think about energy in terms of providing the energy for contraction, but then it takes more energy in order for that muscle and that cell to relax after that. And so
We might have lost Nick.
stiffness or
We just lost you.
And so just improving energy. Oh. At what point?
I think go back to rigor mortis, starting there probably.
Yeah, so rigor mortis was sort of the extreme example of where the last energy available has gone to like stimulating muscle contraction, and there was no energy subsequently to relax the tissue. But having stiff muscles or a muscle cramp can just generally be a sign that your rate of energy supply in that tissue is not matching the rate of energy demand. And so there are a lot of different things that can benefit muscle stiffness, but just increasing your energy supply and production generally is one thing that's easy.
Beautiful. Okay, this one's from Ryan Heaney for $5. Thank you so much, Ryan. And thank you, DBO514, and thank you, Drew. And he says, do you think Mark Ripeto's starting strength model is a good blanket strategy for the average gym goer?
That really depends on what your goal is. Would you want to clarify what the outcome you're looking
Ryan,
for?
let us know in the comments section. What if we're trying to attain the Nicholas Simpson physique? Would that be a good starting strength program?
More like, I can't really bash what I've done in the past because it's gotten me to where I am now, and I have done a lot of basic heavy lifting, but more and more I'm moving away from that, like, again, recognizing that the engine is important in terms of developing the muscles themselves, but paying more attention to that whole drivetrain and like just the benefits of developing things in unison. And for a person that just wants to feel good and to move well generally and to be able to do more things with their body, I generally like the approach that Naudi Aguilar is doing with functional patterns. Okay. If your goal is just to be big and to put on muscle with less of a regard to function, then I think something like starting strength might get you there. Yeah.
Straight from the source. With that, if there are no other super chats, Nick, are there any like final parting words?
Not too much, I guess. We darted around a little bit, but this served as a long introduction, and then I guess if we want to delve deeper into any one specific thing in the future, we can attempt that.
I would be honored to regularly talk to you on here, and so I think you're great, and I appreciate it. And yeah, we did talk about many different things. To be honest, I'm a little fatigued from last night, so I'm happy that we got to do this, that we got to talk, and I could bring you to my audience, and so I sincerely appreciate that.
You.
So let me bring up your Instagram again. So go follow Nick on Instagram, Nicholas Simpson _fit. And is there anything else?
Nothing else for me.
Nick, you're a gentleman. Thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate it. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday evening. It's awesome. Thank you guys. And again, we're taking about a month off, Georgie and I, and Nick too. So we'll be back soon with fresh new live streams. You guys, thank you so much. Nick, you're amazing. Thank you so much. And we're out. Bye, guys.
Have a good night, Danny.
I'll just stay on for a second.